Okay, so let's get the bullet added to our game. First, we just need to access the bullet sprite in our sprites folder and click and drag it into the scene in Unity. The first thing we need to do with our object is to go to Add Component and look for Rigid Body 2D, because we are going to be changing its position and its movement, and we're going to be using the rigid body component to do this. As part of that, when we've added it, make sure you change the body type from dynamic to kinematic, and this is because we don't want our bullet to react to forces, physics forces, as we would expect them to happen in sort of the real world. So for example, if we fire the bullet straight upwards, we don't want gravity to start pushing it back down again. So in order to do that, we click on, or we'll change the body type to kinematic. So once you've done that, go to your assets folder and in scripts, go to right click, create new C# script, and we'll call this one SCR underscore bullet behavior. Double click that to open it up in Visual Studio. So here we've got the bullet script, an empty one. There's a couple of things that we want to do similar to what we did with the player object, because in the first instance, what we want to do is edit or manipulate the bullet's transform component and its position, because we want to access it to make it move upwards. So first of all, we'll create a private transform and call this bullet transform. Don't forget the semicolon. We'll also create a public float for speed, and we're making this public so that we can edit that from within the Unity editor. In void start, we want to take that bullet transform variable and use get component to add that into it. So get component transform, open close bracket, semicolon. So that will automatically get the transform component for the bullet and put it in this variable for the bullet transform. What I'm going to do next is, instead of using void update, I'm going to use fixed update. So the difference between the two is that void update is called once per frame. Depending on a number of different variables, your computer speed, etc., the frame speed will vary, so it will be different from frame to frame potentially. So here we want to create, when we want to mess around with any sort of physics calculations or properties, we want to use fixed update here. So within this, what essentially we need to do is manipulate the Y value of the position. So again, it's messing around with a vector3 property. But this time, instead of creating a new vector3 to add to that on, so instead of a 1, 0, 0 for adding to the x, we'll use 0, 1, 0 to add to the y, because it goes x, y, and z. So instead of creating a new one and then adding it, Unity actually has some shortcuts to do this. So if you look at the vector3 script reference in the Unity documentation, you can see it's got these properties here: back, down, forward, left, negative, infinity, 1, positive, infinity, right, up, and 0. So these are essentially shortcuts for writing out certain vector3 sequences, and this one for up is handy in our case because it's just a shorthand for writing 0, 1, 0. So instead of creating a new one, we can just say bullet transform dot position plus equals vector3 dot up. So that would essentially add each fixed frame to our bullet's position. So if we head into Unity to test that out, don't forget to add your script to your object. While I'm looking at these as well, I've just noticed that my ship is called ship1 and my bullet is called SBR_bullet. So these aren't really great names. So I'm just going to rename my ship to OBJ for object and underscore ship. And I'm going to rename the bullet to OBJ underscore bullet. So my bullet's got my script attached. If I hit play, hopefully we'll see it move up. Yeah, it did move up, but very quickly we couldn't even see it. So this is why within our script we need to multiply that by our speed. Hit save, and then I'm going to head back into Unity so that from the component, the script component, I can change this to 0.02. Save that and hit play, see how that looks. Okay, it's a bit slower, but it's probably too slow. I'm just going to put this to 0.2 and leave it at that. Next up, what we want to do is get our object, our ship object, to create this bullet. And so in order to do that, we need a reference to like a copy of this bullet object that we've created in our editor. So in our assets folder, right click, create a new folder called prefabs. So a prefab in Unity just refers to an object that has sort of pre-existing properties and aesthetics that we can bring into the game. Inside that folder, what we want to do is drag our bullet object from the hierarchy into that folder, and it essentially creates a copy of whatever that object is, so that we can call on it later on in the game. In our case, whenever we hit space, we want to create an instance of this object where the player's position is and make it move upwards. In order to do that, we need to make some changes to the player script. So back in Visual Studio, open up our player behavior. So these first couple of variables that we created are to do with player movement. And I'm going to create a couple more related to the bullet creation. So we need to create a reference here to public, and this is going to be a game object because we want to reference that prefab, which is a game object. I'm going to call this bullet fired or something like that. If you remember back in the last video we looked at in the project settings under input, one of them was the jump one, which uses the space value. So if we use that as our input, we check if space is being pressed, and if it is, we're going to create this game object. So I'm going to just do this in void update for now. So in void update, it's checking our ship's movement and adjusting that. Underneath that, I'm just going to say if the, so it's not input.getAxes. It's different because axes for left and right, it was an axis because it was between -1 and 1, and it's used for gamepad input as well. So it's a value. It can be between -1 and 0. So it could be -0.5, for example, because it's with an analog controller, you've got a bit more sort of precision on it. Whereas with this one, it's literally just whether the spacebar is being pressed or not. So it's not getAxes. We use input.getButton, and then open bracket, and then the name of the reference that we have in the axis thing in here, and we put jump. And then under here, open, close, curly braces, and input should be a capital I. So the command for creating an object is instantiate. We need to give it a few different values. First, it wants to know which object we want to create. In our case, it's going to be our bullet fired game object that we created at the top here. And then wants to know a position and a rotation, and there are some other properties that we can give it. And in the PowerPoint on Canvas, if you're following that, it does do this a different way. So it creates a new transform that we set to the player's transform, but instead, because we've already got a reference to the player transform here, I'm just going to say player transform dot position. That's where we want to create this bullet, and we'll create it at the player transform dot rotation. Save that. So if that's all worked correctly, when we head back into Unity, and click on the ship object, we should see it's got a new opening here for a game object. So that's where we put our prefab, because that's the reference it uses for what it's going to create when we press space and we want to create the bullet. So drag this bullet prefab into that slot, and we can test this out by pressing play. So yep, there we go, it creates these bullet objects. As you can see, because it's using sort of every frame, it's just creating an endless stream of bullets, because there's no sort of check on how often I'm allowed to do this. So that's probably something that we should implement to add a bit more challenge to the game. So the way we're going to control how often the player is allowed to fire is using Unity, a Unity value called time.time, and essentially this just tracks how long the game has been running for in seconds, I think. So open up your player script again, and in the top here I'm going to add another set of variables underneath the bullet creation section. So firstly, we want a public float, and this one's called fire rate, and this is going to control the time between shots we can take. And then a private float that we don't need access to anywhere else, called next fire. So then what we're going to do in void update when we hit spacebar is we are going to, in our if statement, I'll type this out and then try and explain it afterwards, but essentially we want to check if input.getBone is jump, and we want to check if time.time, so the amount of time it's been since the start of the game, is greater than our next fire value. Okay, so remember, next fire is the private float. We didn't give it a default value, so that's going to start at 0. So at the start of the game, when we check this this sort of if statement, if we press space, the amount of time since the start of the game will probably be greater than 0, and so this will read true. The thing that we want to manipulate under here is we will say set next fire to be equal to time.time, so the current time at when we press fire, plus our fire rate. Okay, so what's this? What will this do? Well, at the start of the game, next fire is 0, so it's just 0. That's the default value. So if we're pressing space, the time increases from as soon as the time.time increases from as soon as the game starts. So say, I don't know, 5 seconds have passed. 5 is greater than 0, so that is going to be true. It's then going to create a copy of our bullet, and it's then going to set next fire, so it's going to update this value that it checked against. So it's going to set that to whatever the current time is. So say it's now 6 with a second that's gone past since the bullet being created, plus our fire rate. So our fire rate is what we decide. So if we decide the player can shoot the bullet every 1 second, it'll then set the fire rate to 7. If time.time is 6 and that's 1, it'll say next fire is 7. It will then mean that if we have the space bar pressed, and it's now 6.5 seconds along, this is no longer true. So it's now false. So it's not going to allow this creation of the bullet to execute. It's going to wait until that second has passed, and this next fire value, because that is 7, it's going to wait until time.time is greater than that before it'll allow us to fire another shot. Hopefully that makes sense. So save that script, head into Unity, and we now have this fire rate value. So if I did put 1 and hit play, held on to the spacebar, you can see I'm holding spacebar down, but it's firing a lot slower. That's probably too slow. We probably want it a bit quicker than that. So if we set it to 0.5 here and try that, it's probably a bit better. Next time we'll look at adding enemies in that will disappear when they are hit by one of these bullets.